In this lesson, we'll review the models of the spinal cord. Let's begin by taking a look at the external features. So one of the models that you're going to see is a posterior view of the torso. All the way at the top would be the beginning of the spinal cord, about the level of the foramen magnum. And then the spinal cord is going to go down. And remember, it only goes down to the level of L1, L2. So I labeled here the transverse processes of L1 and L2. In the cervical spine, and I have some blow-ups of this, but in the cervical spine, we see a little bit of a swelling, a little bit of an enlargement known as the cervical enlargement. And it's from the cervical enlargement that we get the 8 cervical nerves, the 8 pair of cervical nerves. So let's take a look at those. When you look here, you can see this would be the beginning of the spinal cord, again, about the level of the foramen magnum. A little bit more swollen here. So this is going to be the cervical enlargement. And then you can see these cervical nerves coming down. Again, there's 8 pair, and they're heading down towards the shoulder and the upper limb. So they're running down at an angle. The thoracic nerves, if you notice, they come right out from the thoracic spinal cord and they just go in between the ribs. So they're going to run out kind of horizontally. So there's 12 pair of thoracic nerves, or you can call them intercostal nerves. So this is a blow up of the lower part of the spinal cord. So again, the spinal cord ends as a point right there. See that little point right there? This is known as the conus medullaris. Again, it's going to be somewhere between L1 and L2. Now, all of these nerve roots coming down are coming from a little bit of an enlargement above the conus medullaris called the lumbar enlargement. We don't see that, but these would be the 5 pair of lumbar nerves, 5 pair of sacral nerves, the coccygeal nerve. All of these nerves here are heading down towards the buttock area, the lower limbs, that type of thing. Right in the middle, extending down from the conus medullaris, this central line right here, this is going to go all the way down to the coccyx. This is an extension of the pia mater, known as the filum terminale. Now, all of these nerve roots here, plus the filum terminale, collectively form the cauda equina. The literal translation of the cauda equina is the horse's tail. Right? When the anatomists looked at it, they saw all this leash of nerves coming down here. It resembled the back end of a horse's tail. Okay. The last two external features of the spinal cord are going to be two grooves. One in the front of the spinal cord is known as the anterior median fissure. So if you take a look right here, that deep groove right there, anterior meaning the front, median midline, and a fissure is a deep groove. On the posterior side, that little V where the brown line goes in and then up again here, that little V, that's that shallow indentation on the back known as the posterior median sulcus. Again, sulcus is a shallow groove. Okay, now there are 3 protective membranes known as meninges. So the innermost meninge, this is the spinal cord, this white tissue right here on the spinal cord goes all the way around, would be the pia mater, right? Pia meaning delicate, mater meaning mother. A little bit away from the pia mater, you can see there's a space right here. This membrane right here is going to be the arachnoid mater. Arachnoid mater. So that's the middle membrane. And then laying right on top of it, they're not connected, you could separate them. This would be the dura mater right there. That would be the dura mater. See, we could blow this up a little bit. So again, pia, arachnoid, dura. Now, these 3 meninges are associated with some important spaces. Let's take a look. If this is the dura, again, I'll make it a little bit bigger. If this is the dura, just outside the dura is the epidural space, right? Epi means upon. So it's just upon or outside of the dura mater. But notice it's not an empty space. It's actually filled with some materials. You can see there's fat tissue there, and that's going to act as a shock absorber. And then this is a means for blood vessels and even nerves to run up and down the spinal cord. So that's the epidural space. Now, below the dura mater, this kind of brownish line right there, that represents a potential space, meaning that there should be nothing in it. It's called the subdural space, right? Sub means below the dura. That's there should nothing in there. Sometimes people have trauma. There could be some bleeding in there. All right, we would have what they call a subdural hematoma. The third space is under the arachnoid mater. Look at the size of this. This is a big space here. This is called the subarachnoid space, and this contains cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, so I'm just going to go back a minute. All right, so three meninges, pia, arachnoid, dura. Three spaces: epidural space, subdural space, subarachnoid space. So those are the main external features that you would see on your fourth practical. Let's shift now to the internal anatomy, right? If we took the spinal cord and chopped it in half, what we see is areas of gray and white matter. This butterfly shaped structure right here is all gray matter. So this would consist of like unmyelinated structures, things like unmyelinated axons, cell bodies, dendrites, neuroglia. None of those things have myelin, so they're going to be concentrated in this area here. There are three horns that I'd like you to know. Make it a little bit bigger for you. Back here, this is the posterior horn. This is where sensory information enters the spinal cord. In the front, this is known as the anterior horn here. This is where motor information is going to leave the spinal cord. And then over here, this is the lateral horn. This is where motor information is also going to leave the spinal cord. The difference between the anterior horn and the lateral horn, the anterior horn gives rise to neurons that are somatic efferent or somatic motor, where the lateral horn is giving rise to neurons that are visceral efferent or visceral motor, right? These are actually going to the organs. Okay, so posterior horn, anterior horn, lateral horn. Again, it's important to know anterior from posterior. I usually look at the anterior median fissure as a reference point. Okay, then I know I'm looking at the front. So there is communication between, say, the right side of the spinal cord and the left side as far as the gray matter. So any interneurons that are going to cross from one side to the other are going to go through this crossbar right here, known as the gray commissure. And so that allows for neurons to cross from one side to the other. Last structure. In the middle of the gray commissure, there's another structure that contains cerebrospinal fluid. This is called the central canal. It's like a tube that runs right up and down the middle of the spinal cord. So that is our gray matter structures. Now, around the gray matter is white matter. So anything, or I should say, any axons that are myelinated are going to appear bright white. So here we have axons running up and down the spinal cord, up to the brain and down from the brain, and they're going to be myelinated. They're going to look white. So these we're going to call columns. This is the posterior white column. In the front, anterior white column. On the sides, lateral white column. This happens to be the left side. This happens to be the right side. And again, within these columns are bundles of axons, relaying information up to the brain and then information down from the brain. Okay. At each level of the spinal cord, we give off spinal nerves. There's a total of 31 pair of spinal nerves. Let's take a look at how they're formed. So each spinal nerve is formed by the union of two roots. In the back, all of this here is the posterior root. Right there, all of that is the posterior root. And in the front, those fibers right there, and then this structure here is all the anterior root. Let's bring this a little bit bigger to you. Right, posterior root. And then in the front here, all of that is the anterior root. So sensory information comes in the posterior root, and then it goes into the posterior horn. Motor information leaves the anterior horn and goes into the anterior root. Right, so sensory information always goes in the back. Motor information always goes out the front. Now, the cell body of these motor neurons live here in the anterior horn, but the cell body of the sensory neurons don't live in the spinal cord. The cell body of the sensory neurons live in this swelling right here, which is known as a ganglia. This happens to be called the posterior nerve root ganglia. And again, it's going to contain the cell bodies of the sensory neurons. A ganglia is think of it as a cluster of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so each spinal nerve is formed by, again, the union of a posterior root with an anterior root. And again, the posterior root has one extra feature, has the swelling right here, known as the posterior nerve root ganglia. Finally, when the spinal nerve emerges from the spinal cord, it's going to branch into a couple different branches. This little guy right here is going to head to the back of the body and innervate the skin and the muscles on the posterior part of your body, like the back of your neck, the back of your thoracic spine, your torso. This would be called the posterior. Let's see, we get this over for you here. The posterior ramus. A ramus is a branch. Then the little bit larger here, this one is going to go to the front of your body, right? The skin and the muscles on the front of your body, but also it's going to form the nerves that go down into your upper limbs and your lower limbs. So it's a little bit bigger. This one is called the anterior ramus. All right, so posterior ramus, anterior ramus. And that's pretty much everything on this spinal cord model. The last thing I want to show you is a spinal cord reflex. This is where we're going to take what we just learned and show you the reflex arc. The reflex arc has 5 components that I'd like you to know. And so this is one of the models that'll be on the exam that shows the reflex. So for example, here's a piece of skin, right? We can see the epidermis and the dermis here, and then here's the subcutaneous layer, and we're showing some various receptors like free nerve endings, right? These could be like tactile corpuscles. For touch. So these are receptors. They're going to pick up a stimulus. So that's part one. From there, the sensory information is going to be sent in this yellow neuron here. This is the sensory neuron. Notice the sensory neuron is going into the back of the spinal cord, as I mentioned, and it's going through the posterior root. Remember that the posterior root has this swelling. I didn't label it here, but this would be the posterior nerve root ganglia. And we could see here it houses the neuron cell body of this neuron, right? The cell body of this neuron is housed right here. The third component is this green neuron right here. I know it's a little bit chipped. This green neuron is what we call the integrating center or the integrating neuron. This is the neuron that's processing the information that's coming in. And so that's always going to be in the spinal cord. If something needs to be done, the integrating neuron is going to communicate with the fourth part of the reflex arc known as the motor neuron. Again, notice the cell body of the motor neuron lives in the anterior horn. The axon leaves through the anterior root and it's going to go out where it's going to stimulate something that's going to respond to the change, to the stimulus. The part of the body that's going to respond is known as the effector. So let's just say you touch something hot. right? The free nerve endings here, the receptors, would sense you're touching something hot. That's part one. The information goes in the sensory neuron, part two, and it's going to communicate with the integrating neuron, part three, right? That interprets the information coming in. It's going to send a signal out, that's part four, and it's going to go to a muscle that's going to contract and pull your hand away from, let's say, the hot stove or something sharp, whatever the case may be. Okay, so receptor one, sensory neuron two, the integrating neuron or center is going to be in the spinal cord three, the motor neuron four, and then the effector will be part five. And those are the models of the spinal cord.